Flames are pouring from the buildings now. There's cars toppled, buildings entire just crushed and crumbled. I'm not sure if it's safe to report from my vantage point. I really need to leave. Soule Defense has informed me that the surrounding areas are in ruin. I see some people running now. In the opinion of this reporter, if this nation, or in fact the world, ever needed heroes, that time is now. That time is now.
Friends, I think we've met our match.
Holy imposters, Batman! Maybe we can head off another power theft.
In the great hall of the Justice League. Of the Justice League. In the great hall of the Justice League. Of the Justice League.
Super friends, we need your help.
The storm's getting worse. Our exploratory diving bell is...
The escape the money is here in Barry.
Wong and his assistant, Mary Nelson, have managed to...
Our computers indicate that whatever caused it came from somewhere in the Pacific.
We'll start searching that area immediately.
Welcome, friends, to the first of what will probably be quite a number of episodes of the Super Friends podcast. It's your old pal, John S. Drew here, and we're going to be looking at each and every episode of the Super Friends from the ABC network of the 70s and early 80s. And joining me in this journey, as he did with a number of other great cartoons, television shows, is the man himself from 13th Dimension, Mr. Dan Greenfield. Hey, Dan.
Hey, John.
Now, when I said this, you didn't have any hesitation about joining up on this one because there's quite a bit that we also have to kind of slog through here. Why was that?
Well, you know, it's Super Friends. It's such a huge cartoon that I figured this was something that would be worth trying to tackle. I mean, there's a lot of material here. It's also different than some of the stuff that we've talked about before because we've generally, I mean, as far as the Batcave podcast, so much of almost everything we've done has been around Batman and Batman 66 and Filmation Batman. This kind of broadens the field a little bit, obviously, to talk about other heroes and villains, and yet this was obviously a big touchstone in the world of Batman growing up in the 1970s and 80s. You know, Super Friends was the big TV show on network TV when we were kids. We had syndicated stuff, but Saturday morning, Super Friends was one of the big highlights.
Right. And for many kids, this was their gateway to the comic books. And in many respects, when you look at like what they did here with the Super Friends, unlike, say, today with a lot of the interpretations and stuff in television and movies and such, they actually did stay fairly faithful to the comic books.
Yeah, I mean, everything about this show. Well, let me ask you this first. Do you remember discovering the show, or was it just always there for you?
I remember discovering it in 73. I do remember watching it. Was it from the very beginning? I can't tell you. And see, that's the thing with the nature of television back then. Now, and actually, to be fair, I don't know if it was exactly 73, because this particular series got rerun 73, 74, 74, 75, 75, 76. It wasn't until 76 when the next season came along.
Or 77, I think, actually. But
was it? Yeah.
But
okay.
I think so.
Okay. So there you go. So 3-4 years of repeating the same 16 episodes.
Yeah. My recollection was that, and I don't know how we used to even find out about stuff like this. I don't think it was an advertisement in a comic book. It must have been a TV commercial.
Oh, it was a TV commercial. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Meet Super Friends. Superman. Wonder Woman. Aquaman. Batman. Together for the first time with 3 new friends. Wendy, Marvin, and Wonder Dog, Super Friends.
You know, I was by that time already into superheroes. I was already familiar with Adam West. I was already familiar with, I'm pretty sure I was familiar with the Filmation cartoons because of syndication. And then Super Friends came along, and I couldn't tell you exactly whether I was there that first Saturday morning with my legs crossed, looking up at the TV, waiting for it. But I definitely remember being aware of it, early on. It would have been probably that first season because I have memories of where we were living and watching it where we were living. So it kind of lines up. Even then, though, and this is something that your listeners or our listeners are going to have to get used to, is that this won't always be a shiny, happy podcast.
No.
Because these early episodes are not all that great. And I think even as a kid, I seem to remember I always preferred the Filmation cartoons, the DC cartoons, to Super Friends. I always did. I think I like the animation style better, and I know that's sacrilege because of the Alex Toth designs. But I did like the show because it had other heroes in it, but I never liked certain elements of it, like, as we'll get to, Marvin and Wendy and Wonder Dog. And I definitely have mixed feelings about this show.
Well, when it comes to this show, I've got to say that it was my first exposure, because I know I saw this before I even saw the Filmation cartoons. This was my first exposure to Aquaman. It was my first exposure to Wonder Woman. I mean, yeah, there was Batman and Superman I was familiar with thanks to Adam West and George Reeves.
Right, of course.
But the other characters, that was my first exposure. It was my first exposure to Plastic Man, to in terms of the first season here that we're going to be getting into, Plastic Man, The Flash, and I think it was Green Arrow that was the other character who makes a guest appearance in this first season.
Yeah, for me, I mean, I knew who Wonder Woman was. I don't remember that the show, other than the kids, that the show introduced me to any characters. Certainly not Superman. I knew Superman already by then by the George Reeves show, and from, I don't even know if I don't think I knew him from Filmation at that point, because my recollection is that the Filmation Superman cartoons weren't run in New York, or at least I didn't see them until I was a little bit older.
Right.
Because what Channel 5 ran, after school in syndication, it was Batman and Aquaman that they used to run. They didn't used to run the others. So it wasn't until years later that I saw them. So this might have been the first time I'd seen, certainly the first time I'd seen Wonder Woman in animation, obviously. Because I guess the Brady Kids episode that she showed up in, I think, predates this episode of...
It does.
Yeah.
Hi, I'm Diana Prince, the administrative assistant. Can I help you?
I'm Jan Brady. I'm doing a school project on Euclid, the famous Greek mathematician.
Well, perhaps I can help you, Jan.
Gosh, that's very nice of you, Miss Prince.
We interrupt this program to tell you that the Coast Guard reports that a small craft is floundering in heavy seas 5 miles off the coast. We repeat.
Pardon me, Jan. I just thought of something I have to do.
But, gee, she said she was going to help me. I guess I might as well go watch Marcia until Miss Prince comes back. I wonder what it was Miss Prince had to do.
This is a job for Wonder Woman.
Yeah, but I'd never seen that. And Superman, I knew, like I said, from elsewhere, but this probably was the first time I'd ever seen him animated. But Aquaman, it was the Filmation Aquaman that I was familiar with first, because we used to watch those when I was younger. Now, the thing is, when I say younger in this context, could have been 6 months earlier, from the age of 5.5 to 6 or whatever it is. But anyway, you were saying about in terms of your exposure to these characters.
Well, because and that's what drew me in, were the characters themselves and seeing them working together as a team, because before that it was just Batman and Robin, it was Superman, and when it came to Wonder Woman, it was also my first exposure to a woman being strong, like being that. Because there was Batgirl, but Batgirl was more. As we've discussed on the podcast, after a while, she became girl hostage, so. Right,
sure.
Here's Wonder Woman, and we'll see her doing, she'll fly, she'll be able to lift large things, she's got her mental abilities as well, as she controls the invisible jet and such. So that also gave me an impression. So yes, you're right. There's not going to be all shiny happy, but at the same time, it allowed me to experience another view of what it was to be a woman, what it was to be a superhero and such. And it's also why, when it comes to this series, unlike say the other ones that we've done in the past, I'm not going to get into a blow by blow because it's not going to be always shiny, happy. Not going to get into a blow-by-blow, scene-by-scene description of everything here, because honestly, then we could really get rough with this thing, and it could get ugly. And for that matter, when we get into the second season, you've got it broken up into multiple stories. Those podcasts could run forever then if we did it like that. So it's easier if we actually sort of go through it in a way of like, what stood out, what worked, what didn't work, and commenting on it. I mean, there may be times where we may take a particular scene and sort of blow it up into a little more detail, but overall, I think it's best to actually just have a free-flowing discussion of each episode and see where it takes us.
Right.
Yeah.
Now, when you did watch the show, was Super Friends appointment television for you when you were a kid?
I would say yes. Yes, it was. Once I discovered it, it was appointment television, and I made it a point to get up because most of the time Super Friends aired at 8 o'clock in the morning, if I remember correctly, in the original run. So I was up for it, watching it.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah, I remember that because it was superheroes.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I had an early sense that I didn't love the show. I did love it years later when they got into the Legion of Doom and that. I was really into that.
Yes.
But these early episodes, I remember like, okay, well, it's superheroes and it's Saturday morning, so it must be good. So I remember sitting down and watching it and being excited that superheroes were on my TV on Saturday morning. But I don't remember really loving the episodes or and going back and watching this first episode again, it's like I barely remembered it. I was like, I'm sure I saw it as a kid, but if you had asked me to, I've even watched it a couple of times in preparation for this podcast, but I still didn't retain much of it after it was over. I hate to say it, but it is true. But why don't we tell our listeners what the first episode is?
The episode's called The Power Pirate. It aired September 8th, 1973. The brief synopsis here: Anthro is an alien from the planet Trom. He disguises himself as a special inspector from Scotland Yard and attempts to steal the Earth's energy to take back to his planet Trom that is in need of it. Now, here's the thing, too, about this first season that maybe also didn't appeal as much to you, Dan, as a kid, is not only, it's like, okay, there's the Super Friends, there's the heroes, but we didn't really get clearly defined villains in this show. These were more misguided people in a lot of these episodes.
Well, they had certain, with Hanna-Barbera and ABC, and I'm sure that there are listeners who are going to be able to correct us. And I don't pretend to be an expert in Super Friends and its development. And we're going to learn a lot of that as we go along here. We'll discuss a lot of that as we go along here, during this podcast. But one of the things that, for example, Lou Scheimer complained about quite a bit in his book that Tomorrow's put out some years ago that we've referenced on the Batcave podcast, is the issue of violence in children's television. Mm-hmm. And they got a lot of heat in Filmation. And even though Filmation is tame by comparison, you do have, like, right in the opening credits of the Superman Filmation cartoon, a hand firing a handgun, a revolver. The concern that there was too much violence on these shows, even though, again, by today's standards, they're not really violent at all. Super Friends, they were very, very mindful of that. And so the Super Friends aren't necessarily, as you see, superheroes now are considered strike forces. They go after a villain, they go into battle, they do, they have, all of that kind of strategy and what have you. Here, Super Friends isn't really a battling, unit of heroes. What they are is they're basically a rescue team of heroes. And the reason is because they couldn't throw a punch. They didn't have a situation where they were basically allowed to fight villains. They have to respond to a lot of natural disasters and fight a lot of monsters. So the villains tend to be either mad scientists or aliens who were misunderstood. That classic Star Trek trope, like, they're doing this terrible thing to us, but only if they know better. Well, now that they know better, we know more about them, and communication and learning about each other. And those themes are very, very prevalent in Super Friends, just as they were in socially aware shows like Star Trek.
I'm not sure also if a lot of fans know this, those who watch the Super Friends, but like episodes of shows like Shazam and ISIS, there were also educational experts on hand who would go through the scripts.
Right.
And you will find it's not only just a matter of being misguided or misunderstood, but that in the end we will learn a lesson. We get a little preachy. Yeah. It's not as obvious. They don't come stepping out into the front of the camera like Shazam did or Captain Marvel did, but we still do get lessons learned from these episodes.
Right, but the producers were really finding, themselves under pressure to do this.
Yes,
this was all part and parcel. In the same way that the Comics Code Authority came along in the 50s, a self-regulating body. Basically, these production companies and these networks were like, we're going to really have to lay it on thick with the educational aspects of the stuff, or the feds could come after us.
Exactly.
So there was a kind of a mercenary reasoning for them doing this. But at the same time, I will say that watching these episodes, part of my issue with the episodes in the early season, it's not just the fact that there's a lack of action. There's also, in the fact that they're always running around rescuing people as opposed to going into battle. I don't want to sound like a fascist who wants to see superheroes just beating up on each other. That's not my point. but at the same time, part of the appeal of superheroes and part of the reason those stories work is conflict. And having a strong villain really, really does help a strong story, as we've seen in, any number of, movies like Marvel movies and DC movies. Your villain has to go a long way to carry the plot, and you don't have great villains in these early seasons, and that definitely harms you. But I also think a couple of things that definitely weaken these episodes is their length. The Power Pirate is, 45 minutes?
Yes.
45 minutes. Think about this for a second. The direct-to-video movies that DC now makes, that it takes them, they put out, maybe 3 or 4 a year, I think maybe once a quarter that they put one of these things out.
Right.
Those things are about 80 minutes, okay? These guys were putting out more than half of that every week. And they were not writing these things for stories with tight, crisp storylines. There's so much flab in them that they just go on and on and on and on.
Yes.
And I think that like you say, the fact that there's no strong villain and the fact that these episodes are so long, I think really weakens this first season. And I think they were very smart right after, once they got the handle on the show, is definitely better to have shorter, multiple cartoons, shorter, keep them tighter. And I think that's part of why the series improved as it went along.
It did. And it's not only just the stories themselves, but the animation also suffers because of like that it's not consistent throughout this whole first season. There are some that are okay. There are some that are just downright horrible. None of them ever match the promise of what that opening credits gives us.
The opening credits are great.
Yes.
They are great. And first with the music, Hoyt Curtin's music, and it's the bum, 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 bum.
In the great hall of the Justice League, there are assembled the world's 4 greatest heroes, created from the cosmic legends of the universe. Superman.
It sounds really, really great. It promises excitement.
Wonder Woman.
You've got all of the different logos. You've got the Ted Knight's over-the-top narration.
Batman.
Music is great. And you also have, during the episode, you do have, like, flourishes of interesting animation.
Aquaman.
Then you also have, as we've always discussed, the Filmation flip, logos not being in the right places or missing.
And those 3 junior super friends, Wendy, Marvin, and Wonder Dog. Their mission, to fight injustice, to right that which is wrong, and to serve all mankind.
The characters, sometimes the anatomy on the characters is way off. There's that whole bit in the opening where Superman and Marvin are wrestling on the ground.
I can't break the grip. I'm powerless. Help me, someone.
In the Hall of Justice, the Super Friends look on as Superman pleads for help.
I think Superman needs help. What about it, Super Friends? Do we help him or not?
What do you think, chum? He got himself into it, Batman. Let him get himself out of it.
What about you, Aquaman? What do you think?
I agree with Robin. Besides, I don't think all of us can handle Superman's fantastic adversary. Help! Please help! I can't hold out much longer.
It just looks so... Superman's head is like off its axis. You don't get any sense of flow or any real movement, so it's a really kind of a rough start. What do you think of Wendy, Marvin, and Wonder Dog, particularly in comparison to the Wonder Twins?
I don't like them. I don't. I actually, but I was going to ask you, who do you prefer, Wonder Dog or Gleek? And I mean, I prefer neither of them, if at all. But honestly, Gleek at least is better. And giving the Wonder Twins powers and stuff, it just, because I've been watching some of the second season stuff, and even their little hokey short that they get, in the midst of the collection of stories per episode, is leaps and bounds better than having to deal with these three.
We've got to help Superman, even if we all go down together.
You're right, Wonder Woman.
Okay, let's go.
So it's all of you now, huh? You'll have to catch me first.
Marvin!
Huh?
So help me, Marvin. If you land with a thud and ruin the cake I baked for our Super Friends meeting, I'll never forgive you.
Like, wow! I haven't mastered a soft landing yet. Whew, thanks, Wonder Dog. You saved me from a fate worse than death. I'll make sure you get an extra big piece of cake. Okay, 2 pieces, Wonder Mouth.
Yeah, I mean, they definitely, I mean, that it is rather interesting that it did take them 3 or 4 years to come back with another season, and they just pretty much milked these 16 episodes over and over again. But they were smart in the way they did it. They definitely improved after the first season because of that, that aspect. I mean, the plots were still, they were still those kind of, generalized, here's a natural disaster, or here's somebody who's misguided, and we've got to set them on the right path. And the environment, or as we used to say back in the early 70s, we used to call it the ecology, or just ecology, we didn't call it the environment yet. But that was, the environmental themes really run strong through all of these episodes too, which is cool because at the time the pollution and the energy crisis were front page stories just in the same way that they are now, or at least certainly the environment is. But that's why you see a lot of that in this. And in this very first episode, there's this whole issue of conserving energy, and this is right in the thick of the energy crisis. But of the three of them, Wendy's fine.
Yeah, she's fine.
She's perfectly fine. She basically has the same personality as Jaina.
Yes,
she that's pretty much the same. Marvin, I find insufferable.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, he's shaggy without the charm.
Right.
There's nothing about him that I like. And when we first see him, and here's the part that I don't understand. And weirdly, I saw this referenced on whether it was Twitter or Facebook recently. Does Marvin have powers? He calls himself Super Marvin. He wears the shirt. He's got the cape. And there's that scene early on in this first episode where he floats in the air for a while.
Yeah.
And it happens without explanation.
Yeah. I my understanding was with that these were 3 beings, because you got Wonder Dog as well, who were super friends in training, but I never understood that even as a kid. I'm like, but they have no powers other than that's supposed to let us all know that we can all be super friends.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. I thought they were just supposed to be like teen aides. They're not quite sidekick, because I always thought it was funny that these people are the sidekicks to the sidekick.
Right.
Like they're definitely subservient to Robin. They're lower on the totem pole. But at the same time, it's like, okay, well, what's the age difference here? How do they fit in here? Is Robin supposed to be like 17 or 18 and these guys 14 or 15? I've never been entirely clear on the relationship there.
Right.
But I've never been a fan of, I mean, Zan and Jane at least were, they fashioned them into superheroes.
Right.
So I found them more acceptable. But the idea of having that they need to have teen sidekicks, and as it even is stretched to other cartoons, Filmation had it, having to also have the animal, the not quite talking animal trope is. I don't like Gleek, I don't like Wonder Dog, but I guess I don't like Wonder Dog more because again, he's Scooby Doo without the charm, without the, he's basically another version of Scooby Doo.
Well, that's in many ways what some of the episodes of this first season are like.
Yes. Yeah.
Scooby Doo-ish.
That's true. Now, what was interesting here is that, and I watched this with my son Sam. He actually likes Super Friends more than I do, so he should be your partner here. But no, But the thing is that he noticed that. Did it occur to you that the professor here in this episode basically was a Skrull?
See, now it's funny you point that out because we actually do get another Fantastic Four reference later on in the episode because they do use some of the Fantastic Four theme music.
But Aquaman is advised of the situation and speeds to the rescue. Fortunately for the submarine, a bed of incredibly strong seaweed is in the vicinity. While Aquaman begins to fashion a rope from the strong seaweed, he sends word to some friends. A school of whales playing on the surface of the water receives Aquaman's call for help.
Right in the middle of an action sequence.
Yes.
I was like, where is this coming from? That's great. That is really true. But yeah, Sir Cedric. I mean, when they show, he basically looks like, the only thing he's missing are the ridges in his chin, but he pretty much looks like a Skrull.
They may have just used the design. We should bring your son in for a couple of episodes.
Yes, we definitely should. He's interested too.
Okay, cool.
Now I thought it was interesting that they received a trouble alert as opposed to a trouble alert.
Right.
That they changed it. That was something that I noticed also. It's the trouble alert. And the thing is, the trouble alert actually sounds better.
Yes.
But it looks weird.
It does.
But when you see the trouble alert, that makes sense. So
yeah.
There is that. And I did like the fact that, for listeners who are outside the New York area, they make reference to the Indian Point Power Plant. That's a real place. That's actually not that far from where John lives, right, John?
That's right. Not far from my place. I liked also, I want to just get back to that whole introductory scene with Superman and Marvin on the floor wrestling, and stuff. To me, not the most graceful way to introduce Superman. And you're right, he's not animated well. But something else, too, I noted, because the whole voice actor thing there, Danny Dark does the voice of Superman. And I remember as a kid, that was my go-to voice in the comics for years when I would read the comics.
I love that.
Yeah, except for some reason in this first season, I don't like him as Superman.
That's interesting. He does have, he's got that deep voice, and it is one of the memorable Superman voices because it is almost like Dudley Do-Right. He's got that very deep, come on, Wendy, come on, Aquaman. That very commanding, classic, strong sounding voice. I just thought it was weird because you hear him, I think the first time you hear him, he's like, help me.
Yes, maybe that's it.
Yeah, and he sounds like Charlton Heston in the climax of Planet of the Apes when he's pretending that he's been overcome. Help me. And then he gets the jump on Dr. Zaius. That's what it reminds me of.
Yeah.
But yeah, it is weird the way, and this, I mean, I know the idea is that they're supposed to be the mentors to these kids, but it's the whole thing where the other Super Friends are just kind of standing around, kind of going, yeah, well, he's kind of got the jump on. The whole scene is very strange. I think the whole thing it's just a weird way to introduce the series to begin with, let alone Danny Dark's performance.
Right, and as we'll see throughout the first season, the cast will voice other characters, minor characters, and that also throws me off a little bit too, because there's a train scene later on with Dark doing one of the conductors.
I don't think we can make it to the top. We'll have to break her right here on the grade. We'll never be able to hold. Brakeman, do you read me?
Hey, what's happening up there, Jack?
Trouble, Dave, big trouble. We've got all 4 diesels going full blast. But the more power we generate, the less drive we get.
Keep your hands on the brakes and stay with me.
Well, that's it. Our power system's gone haywire.
And he's like,
yeah,
the train's out of control. And it's like, oh boy, okay.
Yeah. Yeah, they all did that. It seemed like Olan Soule did it the least, or at least he's better at hiding his voice.
Yes.
Casey Kasem does a million voices on this show, and you can always tell. But yeah, you'll hear Danny Dark. I always like when you hear them when they do like Southern accents, or they try to pretend that they're doing German accents, but it's the same actor. I always get a big kick out of that. I also do like Norman Alden as Aquaman.
Yes.
It's kind of a unique voice. It's different than the others. He's got. I couldn't put my finger on what it is, but there's a certain timbre in his voice that makes his voice unique from the others. So I think that's pretty good. And I guess it's Shannon Farnan who does Wonder Woman.
Yes.
And that is one of the Wonder Woman voices in my head because she did it. That's again, it's one of those voices that just stays with me. And I think when I think of Wonder Woman, that's one of the voices I definitely think of.
Yeah, no, with the two of them, with the last two, Shannon Farnan, and now I'm just suddenly his voice is Norman
Alden.
Right. The two of them at some point along the series line, both of them will be replaced. And out of all, like, I missed their voices once they were changed.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's true. They did change. Yeah, you're right. They did change them after a period of time. Well, all of them changed. I mean, Batman changed because he became Adam West and, Olan Soule. But yeah, that is true. But still, these are still voices that I do remember, and part of it though is also because I have seen some of these episodes more recently because, thanks to not just the DC app, but we have a lot of these on disc and on download anyway.
Right. I love that this series though is on the DC universe.
Yeah.
I love it. I love it. Now one thing, because as someone who's, especially since we've been doing them on the Batcave podcast and all, the Filmation cartoons, when it comes to Olan Soule and Casey Kasum, I felt that there definitely was a shift in their tone in how they presented Batman and Robin on the Super Friends compared to the Filmation cartoons.
Well, there's a more upbeat sound to their voice, I think, that you hear them, and everything about the Super Friends. Look, Filmation is not exactly grim and gritty Frank Miller, Batman storytelling or superhero storytelling, but it's more straightforward in that this is an adventure story,
right?
Heroes and bad guys, and certainly with Batman and Robin, wasn't in 1977 is when they made that fatal mistake of introducing Batmite onto the show. But those original 1968 Filmation, they're pretty straightforward. Yeah, they're definitely for kids, and yeah, they definitely write down to kids, as we've discussed in a number of episodes. But they're more straightforward than the Super Friends episode, which are more peppier, brighter. Definitely feel even more written down to kids than the Filmation was, because part of the brilliance of what Bruce Timm and his, a crew of writers and artists and animators back, in the early 90s, is that they wrote for all ages. They wrote straight at adult viewers and kids, but in a way that kids were also able to obviously enjoy these shows. These episodes, however, are strictly written for children.
Oh yeah,
they are written, and I think that kind of carries over into the performances, because this is supposed to be a lot more bright and cheerful for younger kids, even than the Filmation target audience. I would say that the Filmation target audience is probably closer to 7 or 8 or 9, whereas the Super Friends, particularly in these early years, I get the impression that it's a little bit younger, maybe 5, 6, or 7. The older kids are going to enjoy it because you're watching superheroes, but the subject matter is a little bit lighter. Right. Would you agree with that, or do you think that's wrong?
No, absolutely. And unfortunately, that's part of the problem, I think, when you talk about, because you mentioned padding and stuff and getting to 45 minutes. I mean, the whole opening scene with the wrestling, later on, Wonder Dog doing the charades bit goes on way too long.
Yeah. And that also goes to the fact that they had 45 minutes. That's long.
Yeah. That
is a really long story that isn't a particularly well-constructed story to begin with.
Right. No, I agree. But there are things that, again, and that I think maybe that's why it appealed to the kid in me, or the kid at the time, and now the kid in me even, because I noted them. There were little things like the hangar area, because I always loved the Hall of Justice, and I wanted to actually see more of it. So it's like, okay, we get to see the hangar area where the vehicles are kept. We get to see the when Batman and Robin go off in the Batmobile, the doors close and there's the Bat logo. Although why there wasn't a Wonder Woman logo on her doors when she and Aquaman left, I'll never understand. But
yeah. I also like how you have that classic the trope of if they're not in the water, because they always have to come up with a water part of the story, because you have to give something Aquaman to do. So there's always something that takes place in the oceans or something that takes place in the local bay or whatever. But when they don't have that going on, the default is, well, just stick them in the plane with Wonder Woman. We'll figure out what to do with them at some point.
Well, see, that's where he plays more of a role in this first season than I think he does in later stories.
That is true.
Because otherwise then you would always have to have some sort of water-based thing. Whereas, like you said, it's all a lot of rescues. And it's like, okay, here's the train. Superman will get that. Here's the boat in trouble. Aquaman will get that. I did like there's an image of Aquaman riding in the storm on the whale doing semaphore. I got a kick out of that.
Yes, yeah.
Captain, look! It's Aquaman! He's shouting something! We'll never hear him above the storm, and we're almost upon the rocks. Look! He's semaphoring! A-N-C-H! Anchor! He wants us to drop our anchors! Give the order to drop anchors! But they'll never hold! That's an order! Aye, aye, sir!
And I think that the underwater animation is okay. I mean, one of the things I've always said about Filmation is that Filmation Aquaman is a great-looking cartoon, even for its limited animation of the time, the mid-'60s. I never thought that Super Friends measured up to Filmation on that point.
No.
But there are actually some decent-looking images in this first episode, though. So it's not terrible. It's just a lot more rudimentary than what Filmation was doing as far as showing Aquaman underwater.
Filmation looks like anime compared to the Super Friends animation. I mean,
it really is amazing, isn't it? Because Hanna-Barbera was the bigger house. It was the more, they had more going on, and also their adventure cartoons from the 60s, Johnny Quest, and the Herculoids and Space Ghost and all those, were much, much smoother than, frankly, the animation in those episodes were better than Filmation and better than Super Friends. So they definitely were it had to have been financial cutbacks, because these early Super Friends episodes do not look as good as, Birdman and Space Ghost and the others. And interestingly, in both cases, Alex Toth did the character design. So you'd think that, so it's clearly the animation itself where they didn't scrimp on the designs. What they did was they scrimped on the actual animation.
Right, exactly. Yeah. Now I got to ask, as the Batman fan here, as the Batman 66 fan, we clearly see that this Batmobile is influenced by the 66 series in its design.
Oh yeah, definitely. Well, this version of the upbeat Batman and Robin, by this time in the comics, 1973. Batman was already once again established as a creature of the night.
Right.
Not as dark and as violent as he would become in the 80s, but definitely much, much darker and much more mature and much more, down to his classic roots, his kind of pulp noirish roots. There was a return to that in the late 60s, and that carried over into the comics well into the 70s. We're talking about the thick of the Bronze Age here.
Right.
But in terms of pop culture, in terms of merchandising, the shinier, happier Batman and Robin were what took hold. And so when people were thinking Batman and Robin, they were thinking the dynamic duo, the Cape Crusaders. There's no reference to Robin being off at Hudson University. It's Batman and Robin are still a team together here. In fact, even though they had, clearly the producers felt that, they wanted to do the Justice League, although they wanted to downplay the fact that it was the Justice League. They wanted to call them the Super Friends. Again, a very upbeat, very happy, very safe name.
Yep.
And they wanted to have these other heroes, and they wanted to add Wonder Woman, and they wanted to have Aquaman and Superman, but they still had to make sure to include Robin, even though Robin is not in the Justice League, because in the popular mindset, I'm sure the producers felt where kids are going to be asking, where's Robin? Batman and Robin go together, and that's all because of Burt Ward and Adam West. Robin, and Batman had been split up by this time in the comics. So the Batman and Robin that you're seeing here, in the same way that the trappings of the Batmobile, this is the same Batman and Robin that's basically connected to the Adam West Burt Ward version, in the same way that Mego action figures and, their Batcave and their Batmobile, also, looked like the George Barris Batmobile and lent itself. I mean, Robin also says, holy this and holy that.
Yes.
That stuff also was carried along. So you definitely had the influence of the 1966 show, even as late as 1973, and that would go through Super Friends well into the 80s. It really wouldn't change. Batman would become a little bit more mysterious looking at the end of the Super Friends series, but for the most part, he was that, shiny, happy, duly deputized agent of the law.
Yeah, but it's funny because we're going to see throughout the run, the gamut of bat vehicles. There'll be bat rockets, there'll be bat boats, there'll be bat helicopters, bat planes. Every time they roll one out, it will be a different design. It won't really have much in the way of the 66 influence there. The Batmobile does, but what I do get a kick out of is that depending on the need, the Batmobile suddenly develops a back seat.
Yes. Yeah, that is a very 1966 thing to do, too. It just exists.
Yeah.
It exists when it needs to. It doesn't exist when it doesn't. There's no explanation. There's no reference. There's no button that he pushes to have two seats come out from under some, whatever, which would be really cool to see. But yeah, it's true that when they have to drive around other characters, they always have to they find a way to just draw it in without ever having to explain it.
Right. I mean, hell, the opening credits has the back seat as Wendy, Marvin, and Wonder Dog try to jump in.
Exactly. Now, did you have any Super Friends stuff when you were a kid? There wasn't really that much. I had two things. I had the Treasury edition, Super Friends edition. And I had a big Colorform set that was called the Super Adventure set. And it was the same cast as the Super Friends, and it wasn't called a Super Friends set. I guess Colorforms didn't have the licensing. They probably had the license to do DC characters, but didn't have the license to call something Super Friends. So they had the Super Adventure set. Instead of it like being more like that 8.5 by 11 size, it was like a much bigger size. So you had all of these characters. And this one big scene, it was like on a dock, so that you could have Aquaman in the water. And I remember spending hours with that thing. I absolutely loved it.
Yeah, I had the Super Friends, the Colorforms thing. I had several of the comics, in particular, one that always stood out to me that I was very fond of. And it was during the Wendy Marvin time, was when Penguin got a group of villains together and they all decided, well, Batman has Robin. We should have our... and they have also Wendy, Marvin, and Wonder Dog that they're teaching. We should have our sidekicks.
Oh, that's great.
And I remember Penguin had Chickadee, which, we had Chickadee also in the Batman 66 show. So I'd always make that connection there and such. And she in the comic book was just as nasty as she was in the 66 show. And that's something too, I would like to, when we get into it timeline wise, I would like to take a look at the comic books and see the progression, because they did do, the transfer. And in fact, they actually made Wendy, Marvin, and Wonder Dog a little more interesting in the comic books than they did in the cartoon series.
That's interesting. And of course, there's now a Wonder, for the first time ever, there's a Wonder Twins comic book.
Yes.
Solo comic book being put out by DC right now.
Yes. Yeah. Now, I don't have a look. We've actually in our discussion here, because we touched on a lot of my notes here. The only other thing I've got here is the fact that, as I say, lessons learned.
We'll be right out.
Now, what do you suppose that's all about?
Don't ask me.
Me either. Okay, let's split.
Where to?
To the city dump.
Yeah.
So we can get rid of all these things that use up energy. We don't want the Earth to end up like the planet of Trome.
That's a fine thought, Marvin and Wonder Dog. But we don't have to get rid of everything. We just have to conserve our energy. Like remembering to turn off the TV set when we're not watching it.
And by turning off the lights when we leave the room.
And by remembering not to leave the record player running. Far out. Did you hear that, Wonder Dog?
Yeah.
We've got lessons about energy conservation and also about asking for help rather than just taking what you need.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Exactly. They're all very basic. I mean, they definitely were writing with morals in mind.
Right.
They definitely had to. They were fending off any potential criticism of children's television. Saturday morning. It was the same thing. The sugar cereals and all of this stuff. There was a lot of focus on this stuff. I mean, there's a lot of focus on it now. But I even remember this being a thing back then about children's television and is it dangerous for you? And I remember sitting there thinking on the phone, like, I'm not in any danger. I'm just having a good time watching Superman, Batman, and Robin run around. What's wrong with this?
No, but there were stories, and I can understand it, that had come out, of people trying to jump off, their roof or their table or whatever, thinking they were Superman. And there were some Batman stories. Hell, there's a story of a kid who ate a bunch of dimes thinking he could become metallic and become like the $6 Million Man.
That's Wow.
Yeah, Lee Majors
Yeah.
had to call him up and say, "Don't do that again."
Sure.
So, they worry that, but the thing is, and just like anything else we've seen, like in the 80s when they said Dungeons and Dragons was causing you to do bad, it's the kid who's got the problem in the first place. And then otherwise we're going to be shielding everybody from everything then, because for fear that it's going to trigger them.
Or even worse, you're going to have really boring cartoons like we got in the first season of Super Friends.
Exactly.
And we're going to talk about every damn one of them.
Every damn one of them, exactly. By the way, the voice of Anthro the alien, that was Ted Knight, right?
I think so.
Yeah, it sounded like him.
I think so, yeah.
Another subdued voice from
Yes.
Ted Knight. Yeah.
Yes, Stentorian.
Yes.
Yes.
Now, what else did you have as far as things you noted?
No, I mean, I think I don't want to give everything up in the first episode, obviously, because we're not doing a line by line reading of these episodes, and thank you for that, by the way. No, I think it's fine. I mean, I definitely noticed that there were some nice animation flourishes. I mean, I don't want to, just for a sense of listening, it's fun to listen to people savage stuff, and it's also fun to celebrate stuff. And we're going to be somewhere in between on some of these episodes because there's a lot of rough moments here. Just more. My biggest complaint about this isn't that they write them to children and all of that stuff. It's because they were made for children, and that's charming. I want to make the distinction here to any listeners. Like, well, why are these guys taking these cartoons so seriously? We're actually the opposite is true. We're not taking them seriously at all. But from just looking at something from the standpoint of nostalgia and looking at it also with just having to sit here as a middle-aged man watching these cartoons that were written specifically for children, the biggest problem that they have is not the messages, not the fact that they didn't have strong villains. It's just the fact that they were tedious. Is that there are long stretches where they just, because they're trying to fill space. It's not quite where, like, for example, everybody loves to knock the 1967 Spider-Man cartoons because they would just use the same stock footage of him swinging through wherever over and over and over again. And that's true. That was a real knock on the show. But it's become such a kitschy part of it that you actually celebrate the fact that it happens. And because it usually is being they used to show that footage while they were playing really cool music.
Right.
There's almost something mesmerizing about it. You get lulled into it. Here, it just the scenes just sometimes just seem to go on forever.
Right.
Where you're just like, oh, come on, guys, get on with it already. And so I again, not to belabor the point that we were talking about earlier, but it was definitely something that they were smart to fix in the later episodes by reducing the length of these individual cartoons.
Right. Well, and to speak to the point of the Spider-Man thing too, is that for the most part, with some exceptions, most of the Spider-Man stories were actually pretty cool because they were adaptations of different ideas and stuff from the comic books and stuff. I mean, yeah, there was
early on that was the case, but they eventually veered off into areas that were just had nothing to do with the comics at all. In fact, it was very different from what was going on in the comics, but those were also really entertaining because they were so trippy and weird and strange and bizarre that it didn't matter that it wasn't much like the cartoon, the comics, because they were so entertaining and weirdly so in their own right. But then again, even a lot of those longer episodes that were like 15, 20 minutes were also felt really padded because those earlier tight Spider-Man episodes, it was 2 episodes per show as opposed to 1. And those episodes were really, really sharp. Well, comparatively speaking, they're really sharp because they only were filling up 8 or 9 minutes as opposed to 45 minutes.
Right. And that's the other thing too. I mean, we also acknowledge that this show was hindered by the what's the word I'm looking for? The morals, the moral direction it was trying to take at the time with the the lack of violence and the lack of which, like as you say, then sort of takes away a little bit from the conflict. Which then, if you don't have conflict, you don't have story.
Right. So, exactly.
Yeah.
But there is a certain gentle charm to watching the shows.
Yes.
It does. It is one of those things that definitely takes you back. I mean, it's for people our age. Filmation for me will never be about Saturday mornings.
Right.
It'll always be about Wednesday afternoon. It'll always be in the context of after school.
Yes.
It had that mystique going about it.
Right.
Super Friends, on the other hand, was emblematic of Saturday morning. which is a totally different kind of freedom and a totally different kind of mindset. When you're, by choice, you're up early in the morning, you run downstairs excitedly, as opposed to being like, oh no, there's school or whatever, or having homework. It was Saturday morning, and Super Friends was really much, really a big part of that Saturday morning experience for people of our generation.
Yes, absolutely. I agree. I totally agree. With that said, all right, because even though, we're not doing this line by line, blow by blow and everything, we're still going to sort of take a step back and taking a cue from the star fields that would later appear in later episodes of the Super Friends as their transitions. How many stars out of 5 would you give this opening episode?
I would say 2. Because, I can't sit here and say, okay, episode 5, Dr. Pelagian's War, that's a real classic, and I know what's coming, so Power Pirate only gets 2 out of 5. It's not like that. It's just that I do know that they were able to improve the show substantially, so I am kind of grading it in that regard. But just as I'm really kind of looking at these things as I go, so I'll be grading these things as I go. So I would say 2 out of 5. It's not terrible. I mean, none of these are terrible. I hate to grade too harshly, but it's also really not that entertaining in and of itself. So I can't say it's like a 3 or a 4. It's certainly not a 5. So I'd stick with a 2 because it also will give the opportunity for the show to grow.
Right. Yeah, I'm pretty much on the same page. I would, at best, I might go 3, only because it's the first episode. Like it just earns a star for being the first episode out of the gate and showing us the potential and also showing us the pitfalls that we're going to see along the way. But definitely. I mean, it's a 2. It's because if this was any place else, it would definitely be a solid 2.
Right. And you have, there are obviously the benefits just looking at the episode anyway. I mean, yes, you're getting the opening credits for the first time. The Alex Toth character designs. There are some really nice animation flourishes. There's one scene where you see Batman and Robin swinging, and it really looks good with the two of them swinging through the screen. And there's some, definite, things that are in there that show the promise, like you say. I just found it to be a little slow.
Yeah, no, it definitely is, and sadly we're going to see that, And at the same time, there's some episodes I love to pieces, and for various reasons. We've got an episode coming up where they're basically going to retell Superman's origin, and it's fantastic, and I love it. It has its flaws too, but I love it.
I think it's interesting. Why do you think it is that they call them both the Super Friends and the Justice League on the show?
It may have been possibly merchandising. It may have been possibly trying to bring it into the comic book in some way. I don't think there was a comic book planned at that time. And even if it was, they called it Super Friends in the end. But I think it was probably for those, as you pointed out, here's the 5, 6, 7-year-olds. It's Super Friends. But for you kids who are watching it older, it's the Justice League.
Yeah, I think that's it. Because, the funny thing is that as a kid, I never remembered them ever using Justice League. I always just remembered them as being Super Friends. And in that sense, it was always distinguished in my mind, the difference for some reason. Not that I ever thought of them as having to be in the same canon or continuity. I didn't think that way. But it made them distinct, the fact that they were called the Super Friends as opposed to the Justice League. And it's only as I'm going back and watching these as an adult that I realized that they also used to drop the name Justice League as well.
Right.
So. Anyway, anything else that you wanted to add about this one?
No. I just, it's for overall, it's a decent enough start to the series. I mean, like we talked about the flaws and such, and the good points, and I'm looking forward to. I mean, mind you, I will certainly be looking forward more to the second season and beyond. But there's a lot of good in this first one, and we'll see it as we come along to it. I've had some people ask if they could be coming in also as special guests when we get to like the Green Arrow one or the Plastic Man one, and I'm thinking about like bringing them in as well. So we'll have some fun with this first season as we go along. Yeah.
Oh, definitely. No, we definitely want to have other voices heard from. This isn't just going to be John and me.
So before we go though, Dan, 13th Dimension, what's happening over there? Will you be? And I noticed you started talking a little bit about the podcast there. Be doing some more Super Friends stuff there as well.
Yeah, well, of course, as we go along, it was the same way with Filmation, and also, we've also been doing Batman 66 comics over at the Batcave podcast. Also, I'm always writing about what we're talking about. I may not be writing about every single episode, but I will definitely. There are things that are going to prompt me into having story ideas and things that'll definitely kind of inspire me to do some features on the cartoon over at the website. And of course, as always, we have even if we're not writing about Super Friends specifically, so much of what we do at the site is writing about and talking about comic books from the 60s and 70s and 80s. So if you're just finding out who we are through this podcast, check out 13th Dimension, because even if it's not just Super Friends over there, it's a ton of stuff you'll like, because it's all part of that same experience of growing up in the 60s, 70s, and 80s.
Yes, indeed. And that is 13th Dimension, 13thdimension.com.
Yep. And we're also on Twitter and on Facebook. So follow us there.
Very good. Very good. So that's going to do it then for this episode of the World's Greatest Super Friends podcast. Tune in next time. We're dealing with a story with a man named Professor Baffles, and he's on a crusade to destroy all the art in the world.
As one does.
As one does, yes, yes. But I like this part, at least. His accomplices have their own ideas as they try to blackmail the government. It's an interesting idea, but let's see how well the Baffles puzzle plays out on our next episode.
Can't wait.
Yep. So until then, friends, thank you so much for listening. Once again, Dan, everyone, take care.
Bye now.